Hey there, this is Ethan with Lo-Fi Inquiry, and in this video we're going to be discussing the 6 senses of consciousness. Okay, so what do I mean by these 6 senses? Traditionally, when we are talking about senses, we think of it as being the 5 from the body. So we have our touch, our taste, our sight, our smell, and our sound. So all 5 of those are pretty obvious. You can verify that they exist in your direct experience unless you have a medical condition in which they do not. But for most of us, those are the 5 senses. However, there is also a 6th one that goes unnoticed and unacknowledged quite often. And it's very important that we make this distinction, or we make this delineation between this 6th one over here and then the other 5. Okay, so what is the 6th sense? Well, it is the mind. It is the human mind. And what is so interesting about the human mind is that it can actually sort of shape-shift into the other 5 senses. So if you are just sitting and being quiet and thinking, you can actually create visual pictures in your mind's eye. Or you can imagine the taste of a juicy red apple, or you can imagine the texture of a tree, like of a tree and the bark on it, the rough bark. You could imagine all sorts of things and sort of superimpose your mind on top of your normal 5 senses. So if I literally just imagine that red apple, just for example, I can see a red apple even though I'm not seeing a red apple with my eyes. Now the reason that this is so important to actually recognize that the mind is itself a sense is it does one of 2 things, or it does 2 things. One, it actually allows us to see a new way in which reality manifests, okay? So a lot of times we think of reality as being objective reality as being the 5 senses. And we don't really think of the mind as being objective reality. We think of it as being sort of a separate subjective reality. But when we start to acknowledge the mind as just another sense, it starts to sort of recontextualize the way we imagine the mind within our experience. So the mind is no longer separate, or this subjective thing that we separate out from objective reality. Rather, the mind is existing in the exact same space as the other 5 senses. It's existing inside of our awareness. And this is extremely important to acknowledge because similar to how the 5 senses are occurring within your awareness, your 6th sense of the mind is as well. And actually, they are not separate from one another. The exact same space that objects exist within, things that we might define as objective reality, is the exact same space as the other sense of mind, the 6th sense that we're talking about here, that all of those are existing within the exact same space, okay? So there is no real distinction between objective reality and subjective reality. It's all existing within reality, okay? It's a very important point to recognize. And then number two is that when we define the mind as just another sense, it actually separates us. It separates our identity from the mind. Very regularly, we actually think of ourselves as being our minds. We think of ourselves as being that ego, being those thoughts, being those feelings, being those emotions, when in fact, there's more to the picture that is going on. Now, I'm not denying that you are on some level your mind, and even that on some level you are your ego. But what I am making the claim here is that when the mind is seen as being just another sense that is occurring, well then the question immediately becomes, well, who is it that's experiencing the mind? If I'm not the mind, if the mind is just another sense, well then who the fuck is experiencing the mind? Who is experiencing the touch, taste, sight, smell, and sound? And then who's experiencing the mind? What is the awareness or consciousness that is experiencing all of that? So when we make this distinction, when we recognize the mind as being a separate sense within reality, it sort of opens the door to examining what the mind is from a more holistic level. It's existing in the exact same space as your other five senses of your body, and it's also being perceived by something. It's being perceived by consciousness, which is slightly different than how we normally identify ourselves as. We identify ourselves as being that ego, that voice inside of our head, when in fact we are the one perceiving the voice inside of our head, not the other way around. The voices aren't perceiving themselves. There's a awareness that is perceiving the voices. And so it's important to make that distinction, to draw that line, to recognize that the mind is itself another sense, because it allows us to actually investigate the mind from a new angle, from an angle that allows us to not be entangled with the identification of mind, but instead allows us to objectively observe what the mind is in our experience as awareness. Now, the important point here that I would like to sort of add on top of all this is that the mind can further be broken down into a myriad of other sort of distinctions or differences. So an emotion is different from a thought, logic is different from intuition, rationalization is different from, I don't know. You can just keep drawing different distinctions. I think you see where I'm going with this. Or like all these different, the mind is a very complex creature that requires a lot of careful study and observation, but it is ultimately just another experience within our field of consciousness or within our field of awareness. And just for the record, for this video at least, I'm drawing a line between those two, or I'm not drawing a line between those two, awareness and consciousness. They're pretty much the same thing, but yes, start to observe your mind as being another sense and start to investigate, start to inquire who is the one that is aware of the mind, and how is it that the mind actually behaves when we are not entangled into an identity of the mind. It's very different, it's very interesting, and 10 out of 10 would recommend. So that's pretty much all I had to say on the topic for now. Create that distinction in your experience, verify what I am saying, don't take it on as faith by any means at all. I could be full of shit for all you know, so go on ahead and make that investigation yourself, contemplate what exactly I'm saying and the implications thereof. And if you liked the video, hit that like button. If you like the style of content, you like the sort of existential philosophy stuff, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because I really do plan on going into more and more complex topics, deeper and deeper questions and investigations. But a very foundational point is that the mind is just another sense. And we have to view it that way in order to actually investigate what it is and what we are. So until we've created that distinction within our experience, it's harder to probe deeper and deeper and deeper into our own existential nature, or any sort of existential matter for that matter. So kind of a quicker video this time, but yeah, I'll end it here, and until next time.